So Madeline and I, before we had kids, one of the things that we enjoyed doing a lot was going to concerts. Whenever we lived here in Louisville, we lived in Nashville at one point, Virginia, we always tried to find the time to go see a concert. And I think I lost count somewhere over 30 different concerts we had been to. And if you've been to a concert, you know that there's generally a two-step or a three-step process, right? Generally, you get there, and there's an opener. Sometimes there's two openers, and then you get to the main event. Well, most people, when they go to see somebody in concert, they really didn't come to see the openers. They don't really care so much about what they have to sing or what they have to say on stage. They just want to get to the main event. So, I'm your opener. Last quarter, Derek and I taught this class together in the back classroom, but I was really subbing in for Nick. So I'm going to do the first two classes of this quarter, and then Nick and Derek are going to take it from there. And of course, they're the main event. So you got to deal with me for a couple of weeks, but then you'll be rid of me, and you'll be on to the main attraction. We're studying Paul's letter to the Philippians this quarter. And here's how I hope that we can work together for the next 2 weeks, and how I hope you'll work with Derek and Nick for the next 2 weeks. I grew up in my career starting off in a sales role. And in those sales roles, you ask a lot of questions, right? Probing questions, open-ended, trying to get people to respond. And what I learned is that you can't ask closed-ended because yes or no's only get you so far. But what I was always taught is once you ask your open-ended question, you got to shut up and wait for the answer. So, I am really good at asking questions and then being silent. And if you want to stare at me for the next 45 minutes, then don't answer it. But if you want this to be fruitful for you all and for me and for Nick and for Derek, I hope that you'd participate as we go throughout the class this quarter and answer a question or participate and add some of your knowledge into the class as well. Paul's letter to the Philippians really serves as a look into what I think is a very close and personal relationship that Paul has with the Christians in Philippi. Now, it's one of the shorter prison epistles that Paul pens to a church that he had originally planted on one of his missionary journeys. But even though it's one of the shorter prison epistles, I think there is a ton of practical applications, a lot of things that we can study and we can apply and see that in our daily lives and our daily walk. It's also, the letter, a look into how a successful church operates as a unit, how a successful church cares for its members, whether they're local or away, and how a successful church does its very best to further the gospel in its own city, but also in cities, towns, countries abroad. The letter that Paul writes them really accomplishes several things. First, if you look towards the end of the chapter, you're going to see that there's a gentleman by the name of Epaphroditus that's mentioned. Part of the reason that Paul writes this letter to the Philippians is a thank you. They were supportive of him financially on multiple occasions, and he writes to them in part as a thank you. Secondly, Paul also, and I'm going to leave this discussion and debate probably to Nick and to Derek, but Paul was arrested and in prison at the time that he wrote this. Where he was imprisoned, most scholars believe it was Rome. As far as whether it was in a deep, dark dungeon or whether it was actually under house arrest. I think it's the latter of the two. But Paul basically writes this letter in addition to thanking them for their support, the Philippians, but also he writes it to update the Philippians on his health, his circumstances. I mean, they're financially supporting him, so think of it almost like a missionary letter. He's writing back to say thank you, but also say, I'm doing okay, I'm well stocked, I'm well supplied. And then finally, and this is a large chunk of the letter, is he writes them to encourage them through their spiritual walk, writes to them to encourage spiritual growth and maturity as well. So our goal over the next 2 weeks, this class and next week, we're going to look at Philippi, the city, through a historical lens. Then we're going to work through Acts 16, which is where we see Paul begin his second missionary journey and his first encounter with the city of Philippi. And then we're also going to focus on the men that we see in the letter, but also the men that we see that make the trip with Paul on the missionary journey when he first plants the church. Clicker's not working, man. 3 times, 4 times the charm? There we go. All righty. So let's talk first historically about the city of Philippi and really how it came to be. So the original name of the city, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but it was called Cranitas. It was called this, and that name is translated to Little Fountain. This area, Philippi now, but this area called Cranitas had an abundant source of natural springs, basically. So originally named Cranitas, but later on, I'm not a big history buff, so I had to really study up on this stuff and kind of put it to memory, I'll be honest. But there's this guy named Alexander the Great that I think is pretty prominent in history books. But Alexander the Great's father, Philip II, conquered the town in 4th century BC. And the reason that he conquered the town is because not only did they have abundant springs around the city, they also had gold. There were gold mines. So he conquered the city, and then he left basically an outpost of soldiers to guard the city from anyone that would come in and try and loot the gold that they laid claim to. Years, 100 years, 200 years down the road, the city comes under Roman rule. Now, when Philip II conquered the city, you can imagine that's when it got renamed from Cranitas to Philippi. And then in the 2nd century, that's when the city came under Roman rule as a part of the Roman province of Macedonia. From that point, which was somewhere 150 to 200 BC, the city really lives in relative obscurity. Not much mentioned about the city of Philippi from a historical perspective, from extra-biblical sources. But fast forward to 42 BC, and I didn't realize this until I read it, but apparently there was a really famous battle that occurred in Philippi. Any history buffs that know what that battle was? I know, me neither. The battle was the Battle of Philippi with some characters that might sound familiar. Brutus and Cassius versus Antony and Octavian. So, et tu, Brute, right? Individual that betrayed Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar died in 44 BC. Whenever his assassins completed the job, a lot of them fled and left. 2 of those being Brutus and Cassius. So 42 BC, 2 years after Julius Caesar has been murdered, all right, we have this basically civil war occurring, not in Italy, not in Rome, right, but across the way over in Greece. Brutus and Cassius are defeated by Antony and Octavian. Pretty much a coward's way out. Cassius basically saw that he was losing, so he said, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and kill myself. He commits suicide. He's out of the picture. Several days later, weeks later, I don't know the exact time frame, but Brutus basically succumbs to the exact same death. He kills himself, realizing that there is no hope for me at this time. It's basically over. So, 42 BC, you had about 200,000 soldiers that were a part of this civil war, both sides included, okay? They're in Philippi, and what do? Granted, the number's not 200,000 anymore, it's much less because people die in battles like these. But what do you do with all these soldiers? Well, you could take them all back to the homelands, but that costs more money. Travel, lodging, food, all those things. It's expensive to get them back. It would also be extremely risky. You're bringing potentially people back from the losing side of the battle back to Rome, even though they were Romans. You don't want to create unrest again inside the Roman capital. So what do? Well, what they decided is that many of the veterans of that battle, they would actually provide them land allotments. So, battle ends in Philippi, and all of these individuals that were a part of the war, many of them settled and remained in Philippi for the next several generations at that point. Whenever that happened, this is an important part of our discussion, that is when Philippi became a Roman colony, okay? Probably one of the most important things about the city is that it was a Roman colony, and that meant several things. If you were a Roman colony, you were exempt from paying tribute to Caesar. Basically, you were exempt from some various taxes. The Romans had all different sorts of taxes back then: land tax, cattle tax, tribute to Caesar, lots of different things. Being a Roman colony allowed you to remove some of that taxation, so it was advantageous for them. Secondly, if you were a Roman colony, you were able to own and market your own property. Now, if you weren't a Roman colony, you might have lived in a Roman province. That wouldn't necessarily be the case. They also had the ability to self-govern themselves. You had magistrates that were a part of the city that basically enforced rule and acted like the judge, if you will. But they basically created Rome outside of Rome with this colony. Everything about Philippi, after these veterans took over this land and were given different allotments, everything about it was Rome just hundreds of miles away. So their coin, their dress, their holidays, their traditions, it was Rome. This is probably a really bad example, but the way that I thought about it is how maybe one might feel if you lived in Alaska. You're a part of the United States, right? You are U.S. soil, but you're way up there, right? You're pretty far away, but you're still proud to be an American. You know that you're USA through and through. To me, that's what I kind of feel like this situation is with this Roman colony, which is basically dirt, in a sense, that was picked up from Italy and brought over into Greece. And the Philippians were proud of that. They were proud to be citizens. And Paul, in the letter, addresses this because he reminds them that their citizenship is in heaven. And in no other letter to my knowledge does he talk about citizenship specifically, because not necessarily everybody was concerned about where they were a citizen of. But the Philippians loved being citizens of Rome, even though they were way far away from Rome. And he reminds them in the letter, listen, yes, you're Roman citizens, that's great, but your first priority is your citizenship in heaven. Second thing about Philippi, because it was a Roman colony, and there were several throughout Greece, it actually sat on the Via Egnatia. Anybody know what this is? I did, from like social studies in 8th grade. Yeah. The Via Egnatia, it's basically a big road. If you left Rome back in this time and you went southeast, you'd be traveling on a road called the Via Appia. The Via Appia was basically a Roman military road that was created to easily transport the Roman military. But when you got to the southeast part of Italy, kind of hard to go any further. There's just water after that once you get to the end of the boot. If you go over the Adriatic Sea, you come to what is modern-day Bulgaria. At that point is where the Via Egnatia picked up. It was approximately built in 135 BC. So that means that Octavian, Antony, Brutus Cassius, this road was used to transport those militaries during that Battle of Philippi. But it went from modern-day Bulgaria basically all the way over to modern-day Istanbul. It was a 700-mile road, 20 feet wide at most places. It was made out of big stones that they'd put in the ground, dig up a little dirt, and then they'd try and put sand over it to make it somewhat level. Although I'm sure if Phil Morris had a chiropractic business back in the day, he probably could have done a number and a killing on the soldiers that traveled that road in chariots and horses, because I'm sure it was quite uneven. After, or when it was not used for military travel, the Via Egnatia was used for commerce and personal travel. This would actually go from town to town, different Roman colonies. We're going to talk about some different cities here soon, but there's a seaport town called Neapolis where Paul first arrives to before he goes into Philippi. Neapolis is on the Egnatian Way. So is Philippi, Amphipolis, Apollonia, Thessalonica, and if you follow that map, the Egnatian Way travels through all of those. So you had a constant flow of travelers on that road at various times, and we know that when Paul went from Neapolis to Philippi and then on to Thessalonica and Berea, he would have used the same road. It would have only made sense for him to get on that same road and travel to his next destination because it was fairly easy. I think the thing that's also unique about this part of the world and that road is that this is speculation, but it likely could have acted as a jet stream for the gospel. You think about how this stuff traveled, how the gospel traveled by word of mouth. And if I can quickly and easily get on a road and go from one town to the next, you would have this explosion of the gospel to those different cities in different colonies. Okay, so thirdly, and this ties into the Egnatian Way, but the city was very well-to-do. The city itself was pretty prosperous. I tried to take a aerial view of what it looked like, but here's kind of the idea of why it was so prosperous. We know that it's on the Egnatian Way, so that brings commerce and that brings personal travel, but we also read about a certain individual, a certain businesswoman, who set up camp there in Acts 16. Lydia, right? She was the dealer of purple goods, and what do we know about purple goods back in this time? Anybody? Yeah, it was expensive, right? And if you were going to sell expensive stuff, where were you going to go? You're going to go where there's money, right? So she, I think, she lived in Philippi. We'll talk about that later. But clearly she came to a place away from Thyatira, which is across the sea, because she knew that she could offload her product and people would buy it. From different archaeological digs, and this is the ancient Philippi archaeological site that you're looking at on the screen, they've uncovered an agora, which is just a marketplace, basically, an open area where people would come, sell their produce, sell their goods. Likely this is where Lydia probably set up shop on a daily basis to sell her product. But through those digs, they've also found shops, libraries, Roman bathhouses. If you look at the upper right, in the 4th century BC, a theater, an amphitheater was built. So you see that there on the screen, and its relative proximity is a couple hundred yards maybe from that big rectangle, which is the marketplace. And at the time, that was the theater. I I mean, that was like the big deal and the big talk of the town and other towns around it. Once the city got its Roman colony status, being on the Ignatian Way, and with all of this commerce and travel, it would have brought a ton of people to town. I mean, just a ton. So you think about, from a historical perspective, Philippi probably being maybe densely populated, that's speculation, but it was fertile ground for the gospel. And we're going to see as we read through Acts 16, why I think the Holy Spirit directed Paul as he and his companions made their travels on the way. What was unique about Paul's second missionary journey in coming to Philippi? He didn't want to? Yeah, it wasn't his first choice, right? What else is unique about where he's traveling to in Philippi? Okay, not going to a synagogue, yep, that's true. Think 30,000-foot view. Where has the gospel gone to at this point? Has it gone to Europe? It hasn't. This travel of the gospel to Philippi is whole new ground and whole new territory. And Paul's going to find as he goes along his journey, as he visits some of the same towns in his second missionary journey as he did his first. But coming into Philippi, I mean, this is a whole new area that he gets to evangelize to, and the gospel really will spread. Okay. Acts 15, if you'll turn there with me. So before we get into Acts 16, which starts Paul's second missionary journey, let's talk about Acts 15. Okay? Acts 15, a lot going on. It starts off, or back up to 14 actually, Acts chapter 14. Paul and Barnabas basically return from their first missionary journey. And the start of chapter 15, what happens? What do you see there? Yeah, it's the meeting of the Jerusalem Council. But even before they gather together, chapter 15, verse 1, but some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you can't be saved. Right? So we have some rabble-rousers, if you will, that come down from Judea, and we know in the preceding verses that Paul and Barnabas had a lot of great success in evangelizing to the Gentiles. But these men from Judea come down and they say, you know what? Great, you're a Gentile, but if you really want to be saved, you got to abide by the Mosaic law and the traditions of our elders. You got to be circumcised, you got to do X, Y, and Z. And so, to sum it up, Paul and Barnabas disagree with these individuals that come down from Judea, and they say, you know what, let's go back to Jerusalem and let's talk with the apostles and the elders and see what they have to say about this. So they meet, they talk. I'm going to summarize it here, but they basically said that we don't need to hang circumcision on these Gentile converts. It's fine if you're Jewish and you want to uphold some of the traditions that you had, but circumcision is not a requirement to be saved. So, what do? Apostles, the elders, they say, let's draft a letter. So they write up a letter. We've got that in chapter 15, verses 23. And it tells all the Gentiles in this letter that basically, here's what it is. You don't have to be circumcised. Verse 30, it says, so when they were sent off, they being Saul, Barnabas, as well as two other individuals that were sent with them, being Silas and Judas, called Barabbas, says they were sent off and they went down to Antioch, and having gathered the congregation together, they delivered the letter, and when they had read it, they rejoiced because of its encouragement. Down in verse 36 now, and after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let us return and visit the brothers in every city, which we proclaim the word of the Lord, and see how they are. So Paul says to Barnabas, all right, it's time to go back to work. Let's get back on the road and revisit some of the cities where we had planted churches originally on the first missionary journey. And let's see where the Holy Spirit and the wind take us. As Paul and Barnabas start to kind of figure out logistics for the trip, there's a disagreement. What's the disagreement? Yeah. On the first missionary journey, it was Paul, and it was Barnabas, and John Mark came. Well, he bailed in Pamphylia. Said, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. And it says he withdrew from them. So Paul, as he's planning out his next trip, I get it. He's thinking, I want somebody who's reliable. I want to make sure that if we're going to go do some work, that everybody's 100% all the way in. So Barnabas and John Mark sail away to Cyprus, but in verse 40 of chapter 15, Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So as Paul and Silas head out on their journey, they have three things that they're trying to accomplish. There's three different intents to their trip. First, we already read it, is they want to encourage the churches they have already established on the first journey. Second, what are they bringing with them? Piece of paper. What does the paper say? Yeah, it's the letter from the Jerusalem Council. It says that they take that with them and they read it to all the different congregations and churches. They're reinforcing that, yes, you don't have to be, or no, you don't have to be circumcised in order to be saved. The third is what Paul always wanted to do anytime that he got on one of these journeys, is he wanted to evangelize. He wanted to spread the gospel. So as we pick up in Acts 16, I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and read all 10. Verses 1 through 10. Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple there was named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places. For they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily. And they went through the region, in verse 6, of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come up to Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. Verse 8, so passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there, urging him and saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So I know this might be hard to see, but all of Paul's missionary journeys started in Antioch. So just so I can point this out, and then you can follow me from here on. Antioch is basically the top dot in this yellow section in Syria. So he starts in Antioch. He moves to Tarsus. Derbe, we read there in chapter 16, in the first several verses, he goes to Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium. And who does he come across whenever he is in... Thank you. I was trying to figure the city, though. Yes, he comes across Timothy. But what does he have Timothy do? That doesn't make sense. Why would he have him circumcised when he just is bringing a letter that says you don't have to be circumcised to be saved? Yeah. So what Scott said earlier, which is when Paul goes to a city, first thing he does is he goes to the synagogue. And could Timothy have gone to the synagogue and maybe nobody would have asked, or maybe nobody would have known? Right. The Jewish community was a relatively small one, so people knew who his parents were. Probably also knew who his grandmother was, because we know that she's pretty learned in the scriptures as well. So they probably would have known, but maybe he finds a synagogue where they don't really know, and he can skate by. But what would happen if they found out that he wasn't? It'd be a big wall up at that point. The ability for Paul to evangelize in those synagogues to Jews would have become very difficult. So, because Timothy's mother is Jewish, because he has a Jewish background, even though his father's a Greek, you know what? Let's just go ahead for expedience sake, so that we don't have any barriers to entry for the gospel's sake. Let's just go ahead and have you circumcised. So, surface level, it might seem contradictory to what he's trying to do, but ultimately, they move on. So, this is what I find interesting. It's hard to see it from a map's perspective, but if you follow that red line that I was pointing you towards, where the green and the red meet is Antioch and Pisidia. From there to the recorded next stop, which is Troas, on the far left portion of the red space called Asia, which is modern-day Turkey today, that is a 400-mile journey. There's a couple things that stand out to me about this. One, Timothy's probably like all excited, right? Paul's there. He's heard a lot about Paul. He gets to travel with him and with Silas. And they're going to go evangelize and go to new towns and new cities and do a bunch of good stuff. And then 400 miles later, Timothy's sitting there going, what next? Where is this going to lead me? Now, could there have been places they stopped along the way and opportunities they had? Sure. But the way my mind works, because the detail isn't there, they tried to go to so many different places. It says there in chapter 16, verse 6, and they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. So they couldn't really go down towards Ephesus like they did later on in the trip. They just kind of had to skirt the edges. Well, they get up towards Bithynia in verse 7. It says they attempted to go there, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. So we have this lengthy travel that leads to Troas, a seaport town on the edge of the Aegean Sea, and Paul incurs what? What does he see? Verse 9. Yeah, finally. Direction, right? At this point, all they kept hearing was no. Not here, not there. But to their credit, what did they keep doing? I think this is a very practical application today. Even when they were told no, did they say, all right, well, let's go home. This isn't working. Things aren't going our way. I wanted to go here. Holy Spirit wouldn't allow us. I wanted to go there. Holy Spirit wouldn't allow us. No. They trudged on. They moved forward. They kept pushing the gospel ahead. And they find themselves a vision in the night. Come over to Macedonia and help us. And in verse 10, what did they do? And there's a specific word that I'm wanting to pull out here. Because when Paul had seen the vision, immediately, he didn't wait. Now, one would argue that, yeah, he's been chomping at the bit. They traveled for 400 miles. He's ready to go do something. But at the same time, they traveled 400 miles by foot. That would have been tiring. And now I have to hop on a ship, and I have to travel to an island, and then from the island I have to travel to another sea town. But Paul didn't waste time. Vision came in the night. Immediately, he sought to go. And what I find is so fascinating is that Paul never hesitated. No matter the roadblocks that were thrown in his way, he kept moving forward. He kept doing his thing. There's another thing that's interesting about verse 10. I'm asking you to dig deep here. The pronoun changes, okay? Which means what? Who do we believe wrote the book of Acts? Luke. So, verse 9, actually if you go 6, 7, 8, it all uses they. When they had come up, when they went through, they attempted. Passing by Mysia, they went down. In verse 10, and when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go on into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So, it's pretty cool. Luke shows up on the scene in Troas, supposedly. Maybe he was there, maybe he had traveled there and met up with them, but bottom line, the threesome becomes a foursome, and now we have Paul, we have Silas, we have Timothy, and we have Luke as they go on into new ground. I never like to ask this question, but anybody have any comments, anything they'd like to add to this point? Anything that you'd like to discuss that I ran over? Yeah. Yeah. I have to imagine that 400-mile journey, he probably prayed a few times, right? Asked for some help, give me some direction. Also applicable to us whenever doors don't open the way that we want them to. Anybody else? Okay, so verse 11, so setting sail from Troas, we made a direct voyage to Samothrace. So if you look at the map and the tiny words up there, purple space, just below that, Samothrace, which is an island. I read some different commentaries where they might have switched out boats at that point, might have taken one that was more seaworthy, whereas the other one was more like a skiff. I don't know. Thought it was interesting. But the following day, so they stayed overnight, the following day they make it into Neapolis. So Neapolis compared to Philippi, okay? Neapolis is the seaport town. It's on the Ignatian Way. So a lot of ships that might come back and forth in that area probably had some goods, probably a lot of people. Philippi is about 10 miles inland from Neapolis, just up the Ignatian Way. So, for whatever reason, Paul doesn't waste time in what I'm sure is probably a pretty populated sea town, and continues on to Philippi, which it lists as there in verse 12, a leading city of the district of Macedonia, and here we see it defined as a Roman colony. It says we remained in this city some days, and then in 13, on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate to the riverside where we were supposed there was a place of prayer, where we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. So I wasn't intending on doing this until next week, but we can just go ahead and get into it. I thought it might be worthwhile and useful to talk about the individuals that we read about in Acts 16, but also that we read about in the letter that Paul writes to the Philippians. So the four major ones that we either read most about or hear most about are Paul, Silas, Timothy, and I mentioned earlier Epaphroditus. So I'm not looking necessarily for details about these individuals as it only pertains to the letter. It's great if you've got that. But what are some things we just know about Paul in general to help us kind of build this character profile before we get in and Nick and Derek start really diving into the letter? What do we know about him? Details, personality, character traits. He was a strong Christian, okay? All right, very strong, I'd say, if he's going to be doing these different journeys to evangelize. He knew his stuff. Yeah. Yeah. When he persecuted Christians, he did it with great zeal. And still, after his conversion, was zealous for Christ. What else? He was a Roman citizen, yeah, which is very important, especially as we read through Acts 16. Being in a Roman colony like Philippi is and being a Roman citizen afforded him some different benefits. What else about Paul do we know? Pharisee, calls himself at one time the Pharisee of Pharisees, right? What was his profession? Yeah, he's a tent maker, right? Good with his hands, strong maybe. But what was he not? And I always find this so funny. Huh? He was not that. Yeah, he was not married. 2 Corinthians. Did I hear eloquent? Yeah, 2 Corinthians 10:10. I'll start in verse 9. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 9. I do not want to appear to be frightening you with my letters. Verse 10, for they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak. So maybe he wasn't that strong as a tent maker. And his speech of no account. Now, that's what they say. So it might not necessarily be true, but let's say that it is. Think about all the underdog stories that you find in the Bible and how God uses those underdogs for his benefit and his purpose. Paul, potentially someone who didn't look very strong, his bodily presence was weak, and on top of that, his speech was of no account. I read that and think, man, he stunk at public speaking. Or he stuttered. Or he had a lisp. He had something that caused his speech to be of no account. But what does God do? God and the Holy Spirit find a way to use him. Despite his downfalls, despite the drawbacks, he's not perfect. And I don't know about you, but I think through studying Philippians last quarter and trying to understand Paul more as a character, he still sits up on a pedestal. But Paul was just a guy. He was just another person that God used in a very specific and purposeful way. So if Paul was somebody who wasn't something to look at, was somebody who had poor speech, but yet for basically a living beyond tent making, he traveled and taught and spoke consistently everywhere he went. To me, that's a very encouraging thing as you think about who wrote the letter and how God used him in his service. We'll stop there. We'll pick up with the Brady Bunch next week. Appreciate y'all's attention and comments.